I'm Bob Whitaker. Welcome to History Respawned. Today's episode considers Heaven's Vault, the latest game from developer Inkle Studios. Heaven's Vault follows the story of an archaeologist named Aaliyah and her robot Six, as they attempt to uncover the mysterious history of a distant nebula. The game incorporates several elements of archaeology, including site discovery and excavation, as well as the deciphering and translation of an ancient language, which not only reveals the history of the nebula, but also determines the player's path through the narrative. With me to discuss this game is Andrew Reinhard. Andrew is a digital heritage PhD at the University of York, and he is the author of a book on video game archaeology called Archaeogaming, an introduction to archaeology in and of video games. In 2014, Andrew led the team of archaeologists who excavated the Atari burial ground in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Bob, for having me.
Andrew, the developers describe Heaven's Vault as a narrative archaeological science fiction adventure game. Quite a mouthful. Yeah. And I won't ask you to analyze the narrative or the science fiction in this game, but I am interested to hear what you make of the game's depiction of archaeology.
Sure. I've been looking at games that have archaeology in them and also have archaeologists in them. And when I think the first 10 minutes into the game, Heaven's Vault, I was like, finally, finally, I couldn't believe it. There wasn't a single trope used, that we see in these other games, so there wasn't, the archaeologist is dressed sensibly for the field. She's got head covering, she's wearing sturdy pants, she's got boots, she's got a long sleeve shirt, she's ready for the sun. And so, that was quite the departure from, fedora and, whips and stuff. There's no real weapons in the game. There's no real violence in the game that you see, in archaeologically themed games or archaeologists as characters. When you're out in the universe exploring and uncovering the mysteries of the nebula in which Heaven's Vault is set, there's no there's no magic. There's no absolute evil. Nothing that you do raises monsters from the depths, or any of that stuff. And
there's no Nazis either.
No. I was like, God, finally. And so all of that stuff was just a revelation. And let me also say, and this is super important, is that you're not playing like a middle-aged cisgendered white dude. Out in the field. You're playing an archaeologist of color, and she's fantastic, and the game also passes the Bechdel test. So there's a lot of your character talking to other women in the game, and you're not talking about guys or relationships and stuff. So I'm like, God, thank God. So it was just a breath of fresh air, not just from an archaeological perspective, but just from a gaming perspective.
Yeah. So much of the game and the narrative revolves around learning and parsing an ancient language. The player goes into the game knowing very little about this language, and they use guesswork as well as contextual clues to develop translations. And this work requires a lot of backtracking and can often, especially for me, really prove frustrating. But what did you make of the translation mechanic in Heaven's Vault?
Yeah, I'd never seen anything quite like this in a game, and I've been in some of my own personal work. I've been doing some explorations with epigraphy, and then all of a sudden to find epigraphy, which is really the study of inscriptions on objects. All of a sudden here's a game that lets you do epigraphy in real time in the field. I'm like, wow, this is kismet. and so with the inscriptions in Heaven's Vault, they're all fragments, and you'll see this all the time in regular epigraphy and archaeology as well. It's never really a whole text. It's most of it, which is really frustrating. And then you kind of puzzle through it. And so, with the thing in Heaven's Vault, though, is you're actually learning the language as you go. And it's a real language. The developers created this script, which contains over 1,000 characters or logograms, ideograms, and it's not Indo-European, clearly, and it put me more in mind of like Chinese or something, where you're kind of building information based on shapes and stuff, and so you can start making assumptions based on how things appear and number, and they're actually markings there, for just for for all kinds of stuff, prepositions and whatnot.
Yeah.
And as you go, you're getting contextual clues, which kind of help you build the language. And sometimes you're wrong, but the game lets you be wrong until you come back later and you're like, oh, my translation was a little screwed up there. So let me go and fix it. And one of the other cool things is that you're not alone in this game. You will go back to the library on your university planet.
Yeah.
And you'll talk to the librarian and he like helps you with stuff. And so he's like, let's take a look at this text. And then he's like, well, that do you notice this little shape here? This means X. And then you're like, oh yeah. And then you can fix your translation. And so I'm like, wow, this is just like grad school.
It's a great advertisement for the library in general.
Oh my God.
A place that most of my students never go into.
Man,
so
the library is your friend, and the librarian is your friend, and can be a very good friend if you let him. But you can also introduce them to other people too, which is cool. But that's getting away from things.
Yeah.
But still, yeah, use the library all the time. Make it a frequent stop, and you'll be rewarded.
Yeah, I really like how much the character relies on local knowledge as well. There's so many instances in which you come across objects that, you take back with you, and, perhaps the librarian has never seen something like it, but you'll go to an area that is associated with this object and kind of ask the people there, and they'll know immediately, what this is and, what the significance of it is. And so it's really, like you said, it's kind of a team effort. You are really relying on a whole host of other people and their knowledge. And it's not just you who is kind of amazingly deducing on your own the history of whatever object or, glyph you're looking at.
Yeah, this really points to the way that archaeology is now. I think, especially with all the social media that we have and all these connections that we're able to build. And then I've had friends in the field, and they'll go and talk to locals. They'll stop in at a bar or something, and they'll chat somebody up, and they'll get a story about what's in the area and what's around. As part of the exploration of a new place. And so you're doing this kind of tavern archaeology, which is pretty cool. And then with early on in the game, you go to a moon that was colonized by your university planet, and they're not so happy to see you, and they're kind of cagey about stuff. And so you really have to be careful, or you can be a jerk, but I did play through as a nice person the first time I played. The second time I went through, I said, well, what kind of responses do jerks get? And they were real. They don't want to share information with you. They don't want to tell you what's up. And depending on your actions, you'll either get help right away, or people will just clam up, and so it's you'll hear the phrase ethical core used throughout Heaven's Vault, and the game really does have an ethical core, especially when the archaeology is concerned. And so if you're into understanding how if we're interested in decolonizing archaeology as a practice, this is a really good simulation about how to do it, or how to do it wrong, and then how to learn from your mistakes. That was awesome.
Yeah, the game is very into making you learn from your mistakes. I can't tell you how many times I've had to go back to old translations where it's like, oh, clearly this isn't the word for space or sky or anything like that. I have to redo this translation with the help of other people. It's a really humbling game in that sense. But I do love how smart it makes you feel sometimes. For instance, it really puts a heavy emphasis on contextual clues, right? So it's not just about where the inscription is, what kind of object the inscription is on, but then also where that object is within the wider area, like within your environment, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, you go to places that resemble a theater, or they resemble a, kind of a religious site. And so you've got to use that context in order to do the translations, right? Well, it's like, oh, obviously they wouldn't be talking about, warfare or medicine in the context of this theater space, right? So come up with different words that could fit into this inscription.
Yeah, the context-driven translations were just amazing, and you can actually rely on, as you know, you can really rely on older translations that are correct to help inform interpretations of new words based on the object that the thing is on, and where you find it, and what social context, and all of that stuff. Which is just terrific, and actually also very real. And one thing I just thought of is that, some of these translations that you come up against are really long. And so, you'll pick up something, and it's like, oh, there's something inscribed on the hilt of this. And then, it scrolls across your screen. And you're like, what's going on? I can't do this. And so you kind of calm down. And it reminded me like of my language qualifying exams, for my master's, and the fact that you're given all this stuff, you're like, I can't do this. But if you calm down and you start, parsing out the words and parsing out the phrases, you'll get there. But there are some occasions when Alia is like, I can't do this. This is ridiculous. And so she'll take one stab at it, and she's like, eagle's claws, I'm out of here. and then you have to go to the library to get some help.
Yeah. So turning to the narrative, I'm going to avoid spoilers. Hopefully we'll avoid spoilers here. But one thing that struck me as a bit odd was the fact that much of the archaeological work conducted by Leah relates to an empire that only collapsed in the game a few hundred years before the narrative starts.
Yeah.
And as a historian, I often think of archaeology as something that relates to eras with little or no documentary evidence. In other words, eras several hundred years in the past. And I'm wondering, how often do archaeologists consider recent eras of history like we see in Heaven's Vault? What is the usefulness, what is the utility in doing that kind of work?
Yeah, it's, there's so many, pardon the pun, there's so many layers to this question. I can speak to it a little bit, and I know that a lot of my colleagues will be able to do that maybe better than I can, but there are a couple of things at work here. First of all, I personally, started off as a classical archaeologist. I excavated in Greece and in Italy, and, looking at things, from the classical period, archaic period, and then orientalizing when it came to, the Etruscan side I was at. And so, you're dealing with that. But then 20 years later, I'm dealing with digital archaeology and things that were created last month, like Heaven's Vault, for example. I'm taking a look at that in a really clear way, as an archaeologist. And so, you can have the past inform the future and whatnot, but it also reminds me a bit of I dug at the site of Isthmia, and you find this at Corinth as well in Greece, where the early archaeologists kind of blitz through all of this overburden that contained like medieval stuff and early Christian stuff, and to get to what they consider to be the goodies. And I'm like, oh my God, they just blew all this stuff out, and it's gone. We don't know what was there at all. And so that kind of pisses me off. But to get back to that one era that was really important. And so you wonder, as Alia is talking with her supervisor, as to whether or not this is kind of the same thing, where we're going back to the first days of the empire, but not before, and we're ignoring kind of this other stuff that came after. But you're still picking that stuff up. I mean, the game has a really cool visual timeline that allows you to see things in big time or deep time, as well as things that happened 5 minutes ago. And that's really one of the great parts of the game. And so I don't use it a lot, but then you can go in there and you're like, oh wow, I learned all this. After I played the game, I learned all of this history, which is amazing. And then looking at the history of the nebula, through Alia's perspective and everybody who lives there, there's no real memory of anything that might have come before. It's like it was all of us. It was the empire or nothing. And so, like, what's going on here? And that's when you get into this kind of nationalism and this kind of politics and archaeology intertwining, which you see, nowadays with what's happening with the alt-right and their kind of hijacking of history and archaeology for their own purposes. They make it fit a narrative that supports what they're doing, which ignores a big part of the archaeological record, or misinterprets it. And so, there's lessons to be learned in Heaven's Vault about that as well. So, Alia, as a researcher, is finding out that there's really more to the story than what she's been told in school.
Yeah. So, as you've alluded to, I mean, there's a tension in this game between two moon cities. The first is Iox, which is wealthy and the home of a major university. And the second is Elbereth, which is poor but really rich in history. And Alia straddles the line between these two moons. She's originally from Elbereth, but she lives and works on Iox. And she feels a strong kinship to the people and places on Elbereth, but conducts work for the university on Iox. And a lot of that work involves retrieving Elbereth or Elberethian related artifacts for deposit in the University of Ajax. And this sort of tension between countries over archaeological finds and history is pretty common in the modern world. And I'm wondering what you made of this struggle as depicted in Heaven's Vault.
Yeah, this whole issue of colonialism, of also, working or almost like looting, local cultures in order to go to a big institutional museum. We see this in the modern day, and the way that the writers of Heaven's Vault handled this was really adept, and complex. And so, we can talk first about Alia as a researcher. She's from a working class background on a working class planet, and she finds herself in a fancy university. And even the voice actress, who's talking as Alia, she's got a real, kind of street accent in a way. And I see this with friends of mine. I go to the University of York for my PhD, and so some of my friends are born and bred Yorkshire, but they've worked to like mask their accents on occasion, in order to maybe be taken seriously, at their universities or whatnot. But they kind of revert back to the local patois, when they're back in their element or when they're among friends. And so we see that going on. As far as the artifacts go, the first time I played, I didn't hand over anything that I found, and the curator got mad at me. He's like, "You're holding on to stuff. You're holding out on us." And I'm like, "Dude, this is not your material. This is stuff that I'm using for my research, and this doesn't belong to Ajax, and you're not getting any." And he got really angry, and he kept on bugging me about it.
It felt to me like I was fighting Indiana Jones in the Last Crusade. This belongs in a museum.
Yeah, exactly. But you can play that. You can play it that way. You can say, no, I'm not giving this up to this big institution. This belongs back in Elbereth or wherever. And then the second time I played through, I'm like, okay, I'll give some things over that I don't have a need for, or that don't have this kind of historical context that might be important to the Elberethan people or whatever. But that gets into other ethical questions about who am I to make that judgment. And so it's like, wow, this is really hard. And the peer pressure is difficult too. And even when you're on Elbereth, you can talk to a guy who works in an antiquities shop. He's a dealer, and you can make choices: trade or not trade, get information, get other kinds of information, sell or not sell, and then you find out like where's he getting this stuff, and who is he selling to, and where's the money come from. And it really reflects like what's happened, where we see things going on in Syria and other places where people, destitute people and also unscrupulous people, are robbing out their own heritage or selling out their own heritage so they can eat. These rich, Western buyers are, they're just taking the stuff and, paying money for it. And that stuff is lost forever. So you playing this game, like, wow, this is really touching on what's happening now. But yeah, you can play it one way or the other, and see where that gets you. So yeah, it's super complex when it deals with dealing with local artifacts and all of that.
Yeah. All right, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Bob.
All right, that does it for today's episode of History Respawn. If you're interested in our work and you want to support us, please check out our page on Patreon at www.patreon.com/History Respawn. Until next time, goodbye.